Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched My Dinner with Andre from 1981. This is a movie that has been on my list for a long time, and one that I haven't gotten around to because I kind of don't know what it is. Don't. I still kind of don't know what it is. This is a movie that gets referenced fairly frequently, mostly by people who are sort of, say, cinema and theater insiders. There's lots of sort of pop culture references to it, and yet it's a film that I've met almost nobody who's actually ever watched it themselves. And I kind of understand why. Curiously, I'll cut to the chase and say I can see very good reasons for people to both love and hate this film, because it's profoundly weird, but in a very benign, bordering on boring kind of way. This is a movie that doesn't feel very much like a movie, but that's not because it feels very much like theater either. This is definitely coming out of a sort of theatrical idea, but when thinking about the content of this movie in the form of a theatrical performance instead, it feels to me that it would lose a lot of this sort of finesse that is present in the direction, that is sort of important to how it's presented. This does not follow pretty much any standards of cinema in a lot. Well, I shouldn't say any. It doesn't follow a lot of cinematic standards, and really isn't trying to be anything other than exactly what it is. And what it is a movie of two guys having a conversation over dinner. That's pretty much all it is. There's a lot there to unpack, though. And one of the things I find most interesting about it is that in a lot of in multiple different ways, this is an effort in juxtaposition of sort of diametrically opposed concepts. That this is both a very broad, a movie with a very broad subject and a very niche subject. It is a movie that is about existentialism and all kinds of the great questions of life, and yet about just being a normal human and very grounded at the same time. It's a movie about how one has normal interactions with people that you know. And I think it is so real in its writing and presentation that it's easy for pretty much anyone who's watched this film to have a moment, at least, where they say, yeah, I've had a conversation or a moment of conversation just like that before at some point. And yet at no point is it dull. At no point is it at no point does it delve into being trite and unsurprising. And it manages to avoid all tropes, basically. There are tropes that it sort of establishes in a weird sort of way, or by sort of association long later. But it's also a movie that does not engage you like a normal movie. It is not trying to hook you. It is not trying even to make its characters particularly interesting. Or at least not in a compellingly interesting way. It is telling a story of two people having a conversation that is awkward. The setup is awkward. The whole setup of the movie being that these two individuals are sitting down after years of not having spoken to each other, but they're old friends, and sort of one of them initially telling stories of what had happened to them over the last couple of years, and then a continuation of that conversation that gets to be a little bit more dialogue-y. But it starts heavily monologued, and not in a way that's particularly compelling. And that's particularly notable because primarily what this movie ends up being is sort of a character study. But at the same time, it's kind of a bad character study in the traditional sense. You do not get a grand arc, grand understanding, large-scale understanding of these characters. While they talk about so many different subjects, you really don't get a great perspective of who either of the individuals are. What you do get is a snapshot, basically, of two odd, unique people in a particular point in their lives who have once known each other, are getting to know each other again, and it's odd. It's awkward. It's got moments of genuine discomfort and confusion. And part of the experience is watching as Wallace Shawn's character, is sort of the first half of the movie, basically, is almost a monologue, bordering on a monologue by Andre Gregory, who's playing sort of a version of himself, and Wallace playing a version of himself. Mostly sort of monologuing, and mostly what you get is Wallace's reaction faces, these small things in his physical acting, in these reverse shots that sort of give you a perspective of how he's processing what he's hearing. Because the stories that Andre tells are profoundly weird and nonlinear, and sometimes even completely nonsensical. A lot of the stories that are told are the most boring version of the story that could be told. Quite often there are these sort of asides that are half a sentence where more often Andre than Wallace says something to the effect of, "Oh, you remember that thing I was telling you about with this situation that was going on?" And then he just moves on. But that situation was a 20-minute story unto itself that you never get to hear. And so instead, what often you get is these kind of dull, kind of not particularly well told stories. Andre is not an immaculate storyteller. He's not trying to wow on Wallace with his escapades. It's a very sort of earnest telling of his experiences, and yet at the same time, he's sort of you see these multiple sides to Andre as a character, where it's almost sometimes hard to know whether he even believes his own stories, whether they're true, whether they are true, whether he believes they're true, or whether he's actually just actively making things up. And that's basically entirely in my mind, my interpretation of watching the stories being told. There's never really any suggestion of that. It's just my interpretation. And so that's what's kind of really interesting about the movie is that it is very, very meta. It is about what you as a watcher can get out of it more than it is about the text itself. And so there's so many elements in here that on their own kind of feel bad. So I could understand why somebody could watch 20 minutes of this movie, be bored, and leave. I could understand why somebody could watch an hour of this movie, be bored, confused, and leave. I could understand why somebody would get very near the end, be confused and annoyed, and leave. And I could see how somebody could get to the end of this film and just be annoyed and leave, because the content of the film is about people, and people being deeply flawed. Both in the text and the subtext, it's talking about like what it is to be a human being, and both the breadth and the narrowness of a human experience. That you can get that you can have experiences that are profoundly important to you, and mean a ton through your own interpretation, and also that somebody else can look at that and say, that's garbage, you've made that all up in your head. Or like that's not like a spoiler or anything, that's like my own interpretation of some of the things that are told by both characters here, where the two characters are kind of heavily juxtaposed in the text, and it's not entirely obvious that that's the case until a substantial way through the movie. Like I said, the first half is really mostly an Andre monologue. So getting your interpretation, or if for some reason you decided that your reading of Andre's story should be based on Wallace's reactions, he is enough of an enigma at that point to not necessarily set your interpretations too strongly. So I went through a good chunk of the film sort of being confused whether this was supposed to be very much in earnest or whether it is supposed to be satirical. And I think by the end, my conclusion is that it's sort of both at the same time. There's a lot of highfalutin kind of pretentious language. There's a lot of looking at some sort of very hippy-dippy kind of behaviors and bohemian attitudes and all these sorts of things that you could interpret with full earnestness as being like somebody's genuine like reckoning with their life, and at the same, and just as easily be interpreted with as a satire of somebody who is looking for meaning and making stuff up. And so my ultimate conclusion, well, I don't want to say my ultimate conclusion, a conclusion that I sort of found myself having by the end of the film, and I think I will watch this again, and probably a few times, my conclusion was sort of that a lot of the text of the film doesn't matter at all. What's more interesting is the subtext, the subtext even, about the types of personalities and the types of lives these two individuals have lived, and then what drives them as a result. I think it's a little... Andre is more the main character than Wallace is, and so I think this is more about Andre in terms of this discussion. But what strikes me by the end is more that Wallace is somebody who's just profoundly lost and confused and is in search of meaning that, if we're totally honest, he will probably never find. Because it is sort of the nature of humanity to define your own meaning. And by dipping so deeply and so broadly into these sort of long-term existential crises and thinking about thinking and thinking about philosophy and thinking about like all these other things, that it's so tied up in itself that he seems almost confused by his own search for truth, his own search for meaning, and so he grasps at whatever he can to find meaning. And Wallace plays this perfect contrast to that character of somebody who's certainly struggling in his own ways, but is the sort of the straight man, the person who has a very direct reaction to what he's hearing. And while a lot more complex than the typical straight man character, he's interpreting everything very straightly, but also with a level of, compassion and empathy for this old friend who maybe he doesn't understand anymore, and maybe he doesn't even necessarily agree with or like anymore on some level, but that, he's not insulted by anything that's being said in any way other than one, which is sort of this idea that he brings up a little bit here and there of basically not indirectly confronting him with maybe you're just looking too far. Wallace has a few moments of this pushback of saying, I just like things for things. I like things the way they are. The things that these very small, enjoyable elements of my life are deeply important in sort of a very basic yet very profound way. And so the contrast is what makes this in a lot of ways more bearable. But I don't think any of the discomfort or the boredom or even the poor development of Andre's stories, I think those are all very calculated to lead you to sort of this simultaneous philosophical and anti-philosophical conclusion. It's really hard to talk about this film because even if I was talking about specific things that happen in the film, they're so... everything that happens in this film is so strange that alluding to any particular anecdote is almost meaningless in a vacuum. So... man, this is a weird one to process. It's not incredibly compelling. It's not incredibly well made. It's not, it's not earth-shattering philosophy in a lot of ways. It's not like philosophy student 101 type of stuff, but it's not, it's not profundity or depth on any sort of really aggressive level, because that would almost defeat the purpose of the film, I think. This is not trying to be a philosophical treatise, I don't think. It's not trying to tell you that you should agree with the philosophy of either of these characters, or that either of them are even good people. It's really just, it's almost voyeuristic, the way in which you watch two characters just have a weird dinner, but one that's ultimately kind of, compelling and maybe even perspective changing in some sort of way. I'm not going to say it's an amazing film, but it is deeply, deeply interesting. And I cannot think of anything else that comes really anywhere close to this. It's very odd. As far as the production elements of the movie, I actually thought this movie was older. It is shot on very low quality film in kind of a dimly lit room, very budget, very minimal characters. You've got your two mains and then a few ultimately necessary but barely present side characters, and one room and some footage of the road. But everything is very careful. when all you're doing is filming two people sitting at a table for almost 2 hours, you have to do things to make that somewhat compelling as well visually. And while I do think this movie works as sort of just you could just listen to it as a monologue, you would definitely miss significant elements of the film. You wouldn't miss the meaning, but you would miss subtleties. And so when it comes to, how each of the characters is dressed and how the table is set and what's on the table and what's, the scenery around them, like even down to, I think the most notable set piece actually is the mirror behind their table, which is a fascinating piece of cinematic choice, so that you can have two characters who are directly facing each other. But they use a lot of shots where you sort of see one character, not head on into the camera, but sort of offset 30-45 degrees. And then you see the reflection of the other one in the mirror that's sort of next to / behind them. It's a really interesting composition. And both from a like cinematic standpoint and from sort of you could add an interpretation there from a narrative standpoint of, what are these reflections of people. Both Andre is clearly a character who has these multiple different facets of himself playing throughout the film. He comes off as sort of multiple different characters almost sometimes, not in a sort of like multiple personality schizophrenic kind of way, but in just of like, he's got a lot going on in his head clearly, and not all of it is full-fledged, and so he sort of flips between behavior patterns and characterizations from time to time, and that itself is interesting as well. But the rest of the production is like very, very low budget, but it's careful. The use of lighting, even this sort of sense of intimacy that slowly grows on you, where the lighting is both real and unreal. There's this sort of diegetic use of light, but it is pumped up to an absurdity. The use of like shadow around them to create this sense of like, these are the only two people in the room, but really there's a whole world going on outside of them. These are all elements that those kinds of things are they're small elements, but they make a big difference over the course of an entire film that only uses, a very limited set of shots. Most of the rest of my usual talking points about cinema of any kind of don't fall into any kind of place here. Talking about character is weirdly in a character study is almost pointless, because they're acting in ways, certainly, but these are not grand performances by any means. These are sort of interpretations. The acting more reflects the stories each one is telling, or the direct reaction they're having in the moment, more so than a full established character with such calculated reactions. And again, that sort of adds to this voyeuristic aspect of it. Like, it seems almost like you shouldn't be watching because it's so informal. And so what else? The musical piece, I forget what it is. The musical piece that runs at the end of the film has become sort of also a meme or a trope unto itself, which is kind of funny. I'm sure you've heard that piece of music before. I can't remember what it is. Let me see if I can find it real quick. If I can't, then I'm just gonna skip over it. You can look it up yourself. I don't see it. Okay. So as far as any of the elements of this, like, there's very little to talk about when it comes to most of the cinematic stuff. But I guess could talk about the cinematography itself. I think when basically the only cinematic moves they have to work with are small pans, zooms, and you know, reverse shots, that is a very limiting sort of thing. But there's enough camera work and careful, subtle camera, well, not very subtle actually, enough camera work going on that it does certainly serve to emphasize a lot of not even what's going on, but how it is a very audience serving camera. It is in little ways telling you how to feel, how to focus, the importance of moments, or tells you when to break your focus from, you know, the story that's being told or the character that you're staring at. There's lots of little things there that I think are notable, but it's not like amazing groundbreaking camera work by any means either. It's very weird. It defies explanation in so many ways. And I don't think this movie is for most people. And if somebody says that they didn't get through it, or they did get through it and they found it boring, or they didn't understand it or got anything through they didn't like get anything from it, or they found the whole thing to be pretentious, to be perfectly honest, I think those are totally valid interpretations. It is very pretentious. It is very sort of by the characters themselves. It is pretentious. It feels, you know, satirical to me in enough ways that I think it will pass a lot of people by, and they will take it at face value and not care for it, which I think is totally valid, or they will find it so off-putting because of the pretentiousness and these other sort of alienating elements of who the characters are that it's just hard to watch. I would get any of those interpretations and think they're totally valid. But this is one of those moments where I think suspending your expectations and suspending your assumptions and allowing a character to be whoever and whatever they're going to be in the moment, in the scene, and in the entire course of the film is sort of most important. That's always important for cinematic viewing, but this is a movie where if you don't do that, you're probably going to hate it, I think. Because, like I said, it's a character study about characters that are not particularly compelling, or likable, or, you know, interesting, or in-depth and fleshed out. It's a real weird movie, but I kind of like it. And I'll probably watch it again not that long from now. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.